de développement.
Oui,
Et il y avait un master à Sciences Po, je ne sais pas si vous connaissez, mais c'est une école de politique, de sciences politiques.
oui.
Et je fais des études des affaires internationales.
Mais c'est le nom de l'école, c'est quoi?
Sciences Po, Science Po in English.
Oui, parce qu'il y a aussi l'école où tout le monde qui veut faire quelque chose dans le gouvernement, c'est quoi? C'est
ENA.
voilà,
Non, mais l'ENA, ça vient après Sciences Po.
après, oui. Et comme travail, vous faites quoi tous
En
les
ce,
jours maintenant?
en ce moment, je suis au chômage. Euh, de base, je suis économiste.
Oui, parce que dans votre... Anyway, we should change to English because we're going to do this
You
in
speak
English here.
good French.
Ah, j'étais né en Suisse, alors,
Oh,
mais le parti français. Euh, et les Français, quand je parle français avec eux, ils savent que je suis
Suisse.
né en Suisse. Ils connaissent l'accent.
Oui, il y a un accent.
Bon, okay. I'm speaking with someone in France and I'm practicing my French that I don't get to use often enough because I was born in this French-speaking part of Switzerland, so I take advantage of that. Let me introduce you properly. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Amanda Quintero. And say your last name for me.
Aguerrevere.
Okay, now say it the way an American would say it.
Aguerrevere.
Aguerrevere. That's not good. I'll say it the other way. I don't speak, yeah, the Spanish, so Aguerrevere. Okay, so we're just going to go with Amanda. And Amanda is a, I guess she says Franco-Venezuelan. In other words, she's living in France. She's from Venezuela. She's an economist and writer and international business strategist. Amanda has extensive experience in public policy, global energy markets, and migration. She brings nuanced insight into complex socio-political issues. She's also the author of a book that I have sitting here and we're going to talk about. And here's the cover.
Oh, so nice.
Talk about it. And the cover is We Said Farewell, Stories of Forced Exile. And I just want to show you something so you know that I actually read it because I have a lot of quotes marked to talk about. See how dog-eared it
Oh
is?
my God. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, so I turned the pages down. Anyway, I finished the book this morning quite early. So I was kind of prepared for this. Let's see if I didn't say anything. Okay, so this is a work of fiction, and there's five stories in there about five different people, but it's all also rather biographical because Amanda um, left Venezuela. I don't know if you were forced to leave. Were you forced to leave?
Not strictly, more like the circumstances were such that I felt like it was not an option to stay.
Oh, yeah, and these stories range from things like that to people who were kidnapped, and there's a lot in between. Okay, so In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, which is my commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And so I want to dive in by going right to the end of the book. I was finding a way to introduce this. And I'm going to read actually the epilogue because it kind of sets the whole book up.
Absolutely.
Um, the departures, or the fleeing, or the running away, or being kidnapped and taken away, or whatever, you don't have that. This is me. The departures captured in this book tell stories of choices driven by cascading disappointments, pushing each character to a breaking point where preserving community ties becomes secondary to survival. In these moments of reckoning, the instinct for self-preservation takes over. Enough is enough. Yet leaving home with no intention of returning creates a profound sense of orphanhood. Moving out of the family home is a natural step toward adulthood, usually tempered by the ability to return, to reconnect. But leaving one's country for good, country being the bigger home, is different. It's a disconnection from the community, the land, and the identity that defined us for so long. As maybe I won't say this right, Alejandra, the final voice in this book says, our country of origin intertwines deeply with our sense of self. So the thing is, and I know it's just a passing thing, but I think I read correctly that you translated this yourself from the language you wrote it in.
That's right. I wrote it in Spanish first.
You wrote it in Spanish. You speak French beautifully for someone who's only been in France for 9 years. You translated this book. Translation's tough.
Translation
I
stuff. Yeah.
recently read a really good novel that had been written in German by a Swiss author called Eurotrash by Christian Kracht. And he had his book translated by someone who then won an award for translation, which I didn't know people got awards for translating. And his translator happened to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, down the road from where I live. But when I was reading this, I felt, I mean, a good translation doesn't read exactly like the language that it's translated into. It has to maintain something of the flavor of the original language. Otherwise, you don't have a sense of what the writing was like. But I thought that you did really well. So when you run out of other things to do, are you going to translate other people's books from Spanish into English? Because you're a good translator.
Thank you. Well, right now I'm doing my own translation for my second book. I wrote it in English and I'm doing the translation into Spanish. So at the
Is that
moment,
book, by the way, is this book out? Your new book?
no, this is the not for sale copy.
Oh, okay,
It
great.
will be out on May 5th.
And what is that? Just tell me what that book is.
Yeah, so this is
Unfiltered.
unfiltered story from the feet to the page, stories of wanderlust. So this is a travel memoir. It's a collection of 30 stories and six poems from about 10 years, from the past 10 years in my
Yeah,
life. And they're just travel anecdotes that were either really funny in the moment. A lot of it is humor.
excellent.
So
Yeah, well,
it's
I
like,
look forward to it. We'll do
yeah,
that too. So when we'd like to talk about that, Ernie will book you back again because I really thought this was a terrific book. So I would
thank
love to
you.
read something nonfiction because one of the questions I had reading this, of course, and I've got notes marked where on the page, for instance, I'll just pick one at random. I'll read you a sentence. And this is, I forget whose story this is. Wait a minute. I should always say whose story it is. Anyway, this is somebody's story. And in it, you say, you're writing in the first person. In university, I went through an idealistic phase, believing all that crap about being responsible for fighting and defending democracy. And then I have a note here. Is this you? So is that you?
Uh, I think that was a widespread sentiment in my
Yeah.
generation. So
But
you
is it
could
one you
say it's
shared?
me.
Is that your experience?
Yes, absolutely, it is something because in the case of Venezuela, so when I went into university in 2004, I think.
Yeah.
And in 2005, there was a very major constitutional change that
Yeah.
became a thing. And then in 2007, there was a massive student movement reaction. So
Sure.
I was in university and it became a nationwide thing. And we just were there all of the time and in all sorts of marches and protests and sittings and
Yeah.
whatnot. And I think we thought at that point that that could make a difference
Mm.
in our script of what
Yeah. What
democracies
was
look
happening?
like.
Yeah. So
And
I'm,
yeah,
I'm gonna I'm gonna back up a minute here because I didn't mean to start there. That was silly. I forgot we were doing a podcast and we were just talking for a second. But let's back up a second and set this up because um, Venezuela is not something that people in America think about every day, and our audience is international, so of course there are people who know more and know less. But before we get into the five stories and the bits that I want to read and discuss with you, why don't you give us a thumbnail sketch of the history of Venezuela as it impacted you and tell your story for a minute in terms of, before we get into the fictional stories in the book, tell us a little bit about yourself, as in, A, what was happening in Venezuela, who was in power, because I'm hazy on whether something is Maduro or somebody else, um, what happened, why everybody left, the petrostate oil state thing, so go as long or as short as you want on just the whole situation that you fled.
thank
And
you.
then let's get into the stories because two reasons. One, I'm interested in you because I'm interested in the book. But the second thing is we're living in a time in America that, like the old Chinese saying, don't wish to live in interesting times. Our time is now too interesting here.
Yeah.
So I don't know. When did you write this book? Write it.
I wrote it for 5 years, published
Yeah.
it in 23. So I started writing it in 2018.
Okay, so you were aware when you were writing it of the first Trump presidency, but you were not aware of what's happened since. And so, of course, the context that I'm reading this in the United States of America is odd and different than you might have imagined when translating it into English for the English speaking market. And that is, we tend to have the luxury in the US until Trump was elected the first time. And even then, you thought, oh, well, this will get back to normal someday, of thinking, okay, we're sort of above this kind of thing. So whatever's going on in Venezuela or whatever happened in Brazil or whatever happened with Duarte or, what's going on in all these other countries where strongmen or people take over and chaos reigns and the market crashes, that's thank God that's not happening in America. So whatever happens in America, whether it's Nixon and Watergate or the Vietnam War, the center holds. We'll always kind of be, we make mistakes, we do terrible things sometimes, but this is America. Your book is being read by me now in a context in which most of the authors I'm talking to are Americans, trying to figure out how to navigate something that never happens here. And that is a Venezuelan type situation of absolute chaos from the top on down, very threatening to what we thought was a stable and permanent democracy, losing all credibility around the world. So the crazy thing is, I don't want to make too much of this, but in a weird way, your book could be seen as okay, it's one person's story, and now she's translated into these 5 fictional stories. Very well done, very interesting. But what's this got to do with us? But in a way, unfortunately, right now, sitting here in Massachusetts, USA, at this very moment, this all the stories in this book could have been written from a worst case scenario of how the whole Trump fiasco ends. I mean, this book
Absolutely. I do
written
think
torn
it's
from
a
the
study
headlines.
case.
So comment on that and then do what I asked you to do before I sidetracked myself by asking talk about the context. Give us a context of this book and then, maybe make some parallels with our moment, and then I'm going to get into the book itself.
Good. I'm happy to do that. So Venezuela is one of the first democracies to develop in South America
Yeah,
with the major sponsorship of the United States. That comes sponsored by the oil industry because Venezuela was a huge oil exporter and it
sure.
was one of the most important oil exporters during the Second World War. That's because it is the only one that is outside at that point, outside of the Gulf.
Yeah.
And so it's this strategic piece that is just feeding the American effort in the war and is not threatened geographically. So after that point, Venezuela sort of became a protectorate for many years. There was a free trade agreement with the United States. Venezuela became extremely Americanized. Like the Rockefellers were there, Sears was there. Every like staple of modernism was coming from America to the point that today the national sport is baseball. That
Yeah.
only happens in places where you had stationed a lot of either soldiers or oil industry people.
Yes.
Now, for a number of reasons, there's a first nationalization in the 70s, and that inevitably becomes a problem for the productivity of the country. And there's a slow but sure economic degradation. And with that, at the end of the 90s, a lot of people are unhappy. They just
Yeah.
want a change in regime. A lot of people have crossed the poverty line and they don't trust the bipartisan parties anymore. It
Hmm.
was a very stable bipartisan system for good 70 years, something like that. And
Yeah.
then people lose their trust and they go for the wild card. They decide, you know what? These people, we voted for them for many years. Nothing has changed. We need a change. We're going to vote for this strongman. Now, this strongman had been a coup promoter earlier in the 90s, Chavez. So
Yeah.
Chavez around arrives in power in 98 when I was in primary school, something like this.
Yeah.
And I grew up in that sort of turbulent weather, but I was not in the capital where everything was really like strong felt. I was living in like smaller town, So this was sort of something that happened in the news.
Mm.
Then I moved to Caracas for university. And then, like I was saying, I became a witness in first row of what was happening, like the changes that were happening. Plus, I was
Mm.
studying
Mm.
economics, and that's very entangled with local politics. And so I started participating actively in the student movement, student protests, not all the way to occupations, but really they were massive, massive
Sure.
protests. And eventually, um, they just became more and more violent. Like
Mm.
at the beginning, it would be just like rocks being thrown off. Eventually, the police started to come out. At one point, you start having snipers
Mm.
on rooftops trying to literally kill people with a single shot on the head. So it became like the escalation of the violence. I saw it in my own time in university, like in the years that you're in university, I saw it. So I graduate, I start working for a development bank. So I kind of like exert myself from local politics, but I start collaborating with a person who back then was a presidential candidate
Mm.
as a research assistant for his book. He wanted to publish like this policy book, let's call it. So it
Yeah.
was greatly informed by 20th century history, and then, kind of like saying, okay, this is what's happened. This is my proposal. In the meantime, he gets abducted by the government, and I like that just like became thing. Someone else published it, whatever. So I started to sort of make the decision to leave the country. And this was not just me being, enlightened. It was my entire generation left more or
Yeah.
less at the same time. Like I can tell you from every person I ever went to grade school, middle school, high school, university, my first jobs, there are very few people left in the country. So this
Mm.
was the entire millennial generation left in the span of 10 years. And this
Yeah.
was at the beginning only like the more elite classes, but then it became completely widespread. In 2016, which is like the major breaking point after Chavez had died, the government defaulted on their external debt. And that is something that really can break down a country. And I think the best way for an international audience to understand it is making a parallel with the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Imagine the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. That's exactly what was happening in an accelerated manner in Venezuela in around 2015,
Yeah.
16. So by the time I left, Venezuela, that had always been a very prosperous country, was going through a borderline famine. There was not a famine because people started walking through the border into Colombia, into Brazil. They started taking ships into the Caribbean, taking ships, like literal pirate ships, into Panama and Trinidad and Tobago and all the Antilles. So it was this massive movement.
Yeah.
Almost like a quarter of the country moved out in about 10 years.
Yeah.
And I was part of that movement. And so I relocated myself to France. I had the blessing to have enough savings to sort of like anchor myself into a master's and then figure it out from there. So I was doing a master's in international relations with people from all over the world. And I
Mm.
had a couple of years where this was just a constant conversation. People would tell me like, they wanted to know because it's so poorly covered.
Sure.
Like if you read anything about Venezuela, it's going to be, there's this strongman who changed their mind and now the country's poor.
Yeah.
The script goes something like that. And I was so frustrated
Mm.
because I couldn't see my story reflected anywhere. So I decided to do it. I decided to, you know what, I'm going to write the book that I want to read at some
Yeah.
point because I need to get all of this information
And
out
that's
of my
this
head.
book.
And that is that book,
Yeah.
exactly.
So We Said Farewell is basically a book about departure. Now I'm so interested in this book in terms of placing it in the contemporary context of people who feel very threatened by the Trump presidency and the chaos he's unleashed. And I think there's a similar thing with Venezuela and the US, aside from the politics and the strongman and the authoritarianism and all the rest of this. And that is what I would call massive self-inflicted wounds, totally unnecessary, because
At least in the
Venezuela was
case
doing
of
fine.
Venezuela, that is, I
Venezuela was
absolutely.
doing fine. And then it was like, okay, let's get up one morning and shoot ourselves in the foot and see how that works. And so when you think about what Trump is doing to the United States, here's the most powerful country in the world, or at least it was until his presidency, his second presidency. And now we're in a situation where even if he disappeared tomorrow morning and took everybody who's with him, Elon Musk, all of them were gone, the damage is irreparable because people have lost their trust in the US. We haven't defaulted on our international loans, but it's close. We're no longer trusted. This idea that, well, this could never happen in America, now it's happened. We have a kind of a wannabe strong man, and the world has lost its trust in us, and the economy is going to be in recession and maybe shattered. You never know. But the thing is, there are a lot of people who feel personally threatened by his presidency because he's cracking down on free speech, he's attacking the media, he's attacking our universities. This is completely unprecedented in American history. There's never been a moment like this. So I don't want to turn your book into a book about our present moment in America, but two things. First of all, what happened in Venezuela is not unusual because history is full of self-inflicted wounds. They didn't have to elect Hitler in 1933. It could have gone a different way. People didn't have to, cater to his seizure of power. Um, but since we're living through something very similar in the U.S. right now, let's talk about Venezuela's self-inflicted wound for a minute and have you analyze what that was, both in the personalities involved and just talk about the stability that Venezuela represented. It's this rich country. It's an ally of the United States. Everybody counts on it. It gives us all the oil we need during the war. And then fast forward to you're running away, and a whole generation flees with you. Just talk about what it was that was. Talk about the self-inflicted wound aspect of your story, and then let's get into the book.
So I think, and this might be biased because right now I'm reading this French economist called Thomas Piketty. I don't know if you've heard of him. He wrote like The Modern Capital.
Hmm.
And as I wrote the book, many years later, I understood that in the case of Venezuela, and it might be the case with Trump, the root of the self-inflicted wound was that there was a lot of growing inequality, and the people who were in government were
Hmm.
not recognizing the pain behind that inequality.
Yeah.
Seriously, like there were
Yeah.
many people in Venezuela. Chavez governed from 98 to 2003 with the votes. Like he literally always had the votes. And he governed because he understood that many people had come to the conclusion that the system was broken.
Yeah.
And when the people decide that the system is broken, they are willing to explore something else, something risky, but it has to be something that is not part of the status quo.
Yes. Yeah.
And that is definitely a parallel that you can see. Also, when people this is not me making it up, and just in the case of Venezuela, this is like if you ever go back and look into history for times when people have uprised against the status quo, usually it's a very good moment for a strong man
Sure.
to be very secure of themselves and say, look, this is what we got to do. And all changes always come from loud voices and the ideas that are floating around in the
Mhm.
moment. So if
Mhm.
there's not really anything outside the status quo, it's very easy for people to just follow someone who's going to say, we're going to do it differently. I don't
Yeah.
promise you exactly what that's going to look like. We're going to make it great. I mean,
Yeah.
that's exactly what Chavez used to say. We're going to make Venezuela great again, and we're going to nationalize the oil industry and just going to, shower oil money all over the place, and we're all going to be rich. That was the promise. And people who were, going hungry, not making ends meet, they didn't believe in democracy anymore. So they were
Yeah.
ready for giving up a part of their democratic rights
Mm.
and whatever in exchange for the possibility of an improvement. It was a bit. So that I understood while writing the book and seeing, like, going through the figures,
Yeah.
going through the speeches in
Mm.
hindsight, going through the experience of reading the other type of media, which is something that I never did while I lived in Venezuela because
Mm.
the situation became so polarized. And that is also something that might be happening in the United States. You become so polarized that you only listen to your echo chambers and you only
Yes.
spend time
Yes.
with people who think like yourself and who are in the same type of mentality that this is what we got to do. And so everyone becomes entrenched into their own territory,
Mm.
and that just creates more and more tension. So when I went back and started reading like speeches or listening to YouTube videos from, I don't know, 15 years ago, I'm not going to say I was on their side because I knew all the consequences that went with
Sure.
it, but I was able to empathize and understand in a way that I never did while living in Venezuela because I was surrounded by my own entourage and we were like very convinced that we were in the right.
Yeah.
That was one thing. Then the other thing, and that is the very scary part. I think it is the most scary part that happened in Venezuela as a self-inflicted wound, and that might happen in the United States if there is an actual constitutional crisis. So in Venezuela, Chavez declared a national assembly in the style of the French Revolution. He
Yeah.
literally said, F the Constitution and F everything. We are going to dissolve all the powers and we are going to reinvent the way we organize the state. And that, because the judges allowed it to happen. In the case of Venezuela, it was mostly the judges that allowed it to happen. Everything was changed kind of in the same way that the Trump administration has tried to change legislation with Project 21, Project 25,
25. Yeah.
25. You know, like they had all these paperworks just like up here and they passed it
Hmm.
without any conversation, without doing the due diligence, the politics, without convincing people, without looking for consensus, without taking back then in Venezuela we had a system that is more similar to France. It's called like
Mm.
corporate democracy, which where you don't have only the executive plus the legislative plus lobbyists. You also had, in the case of Venezuela, very well organized guilds. And he basically killed the guilds. He killed
Yeah.
the unions. He dismissed the entire business class, and he just passed whatever legislation he wanted by presidential decree.
Which is
And
what Trump is doing, by the way, with all
exactly. And so
these
eventually
things.
the judge, but at least in the United States, there are judges that are stepping up with the checks and balances. In the
If Trump honors anything they're saying, because
correct.
in the case of a wrongly deported person, for instance, he hasn't brought him back.
Correct. So it's a bit of a different system, but that was what happened in Venezuela. The judges stepped back and the state was like the federal state, the equivalent of the federal state, was reorganized in a way that depended enormously on the figure of the president, a lot more than before. And that lasted while the oil prices were at $150 the barrel.
Yeah.
And at the moment where there was an economic crisis, that was no longer enough because he was
Sure.
governing by, I don't know, what do you call this? Like, um, what is trying to be done to the billionaire class in the States, like
Sure.
tax cuts to the rich
Yeah.
and government contracts to people who were in business who were their favorites and that kind of thing. He was governing with the money.
Yeah, exactly the way Trump is. In other words, Elon Musk gets one kind of deal, and if you don't show up at Trump's inauguration and get your picture taken smiling with him, then
Correct.
he turns against you. And of course, right now he is turning against big American law firms and telling them that if they even represent someone he doesn't like, he's going to make trouble for them. So it's very much a similar pattern.
Yeah, it's kind of like the beginning of what we saw.
Yeah,
Also, like the first story in the book is about a similar experience to Doge.
yeah,
It was this special force that was taken first into the oil industry because it was the most strategic one in Venezuela,
sure.
but it went all the way through the federal government. It was a purge of of partisan people. They literally told everyone we are not working with someone who is not on our camp. If
Yeah,
you're not with me, you are my enemy, and therefore you're not entitled to work for the people. You're not
yeah,
entitled to work for the government. So once that was consolidated, because in Venezuela it did happen, and it went all the way, then things start to get stiff in a way in that, or strict in a way in that people understood, like people like me understood that we were never in our lifetime, as long as the presidency was in this party,
sure,
we would never have any part in government or government related jobs, in government contracts relate like government
sure.
contractor jobs, in anything. For example, my I wanted to be a diplomat and that went out the window.
Yeah,
You cannot be a diplomat for a government that is so radical with their support.
with just people who love the leader.
Correct. And
Yeah,
in an extremely military way, because Chavez was
yeah.
a military person.
And I think one of the big differences between Venezuela and say North Korea, again, is this self-inflicted wound. And I know I sound like a broken record, but American listeners to my podcast in conversation with Frank Schaeffer have to understand something. And that is, we look at lots of parts of the world as sort of disorganized and they don't have the money and they don't have the democratic traditions. What happened in Venezuela, it was as unlikely to happen as, say, if it had happened in Switzerland or France or Belgium. This was a country that was very much in the Western alliance,
Yeah.
and they were friends of the United States, incredibly stable, had a lot of wealth because of oil. It was being properly managed. So let's just cut to the situation as it is today. What's happening in Venezuela right now, and how did it come about? In other words, where is Venezuela as we speak? And then we're going to get into the book.
So the second turn after the first self-infliction is let's bet on this crazy man and let's allow for a constitutional crisis. That was
Yeah,
self self-inflicted wound number one. But then self-inflicted wound number two, which was the catastrophic one, which explains where Venezuela is today, is
yeah,
the Venezuelan state failed and
yeah,
dissolved into a bunch of mafias, like literal mafias, not figurative mafias. They became involved with the FARC and with the drug cartels. And now
yeah,
drug cartels that were operating elsewhere in Latin America are operating in Venezuelan territory in this with the sponsorship of the state of the Venezuelan military.
yeah,
And that sort of snowballed because if you only had like Colombia, if you only had one region of the country where, the narcos are operating there, but everyone else can live their
it's
life,
okay. We can pretend it's
it
okay. Yeah,
became it became ubiquitous. And actually, one of those cartels has been making a lot of noise in the United States because that was one of the groups that the Trump administration has been trying to deport, the Tren de Aragua.
yeah,
And the Tren is this like prison term for a group of people who are commanded by a guy who resides in prison.
yeah.
So the word region
So
of
the
Aragua
head
is
of the
one of
head of the cartel is in prison, but he still is running the cartel.
correct. And Aragua is one state. So there
Yeah,
were like, it became kind of like a feudal state.
yeah,
The prison king of the state so and so became the chief of the cartel of that state.
yeah,
And they started operating first with drug dealing, but then it escalated into a massive organized crime situation.
yeah,
And so they started expanding into global markets, let's call it
yeah.
like
And
that.
is that where it is? Is that where Venezuela is today?
And that is where Venezuela is today.
And in terms of the economy and the oil and all that, is it still an oil state, sort of? Is there still money?
Oh, this is the third piece, that the third magical and inflicted wound.
Self-inflicted wound, yeah.
So that was, we shifted our alliance from the United States and the markets into China. And China started this scheme that was called oil for loan.
Yeah.
It was first tested in Venezuela and then expanded into Africa and other places. Basically, they gave the money up front to the
Hmm.
government, supposedly to invest it in a number of infrastructure projects. I mean, everyone has done this. I don't blame Chinese, honestly. Every every loan giver has done this, like the United States has done this before. Like there's this thing where you give the money and then you hire my contractors and you hire
Sure.
my engineers or whatever.
Hmm.
The special thing with the Chinese government was that they were in their expansion era and they wanted the physical oil. So
Yeah.
they secured this themselves. I mean, just for context, Venezuela has as much oil as Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
in terms of reserves.
Yeah.
So the Chinese were very smart and they decided, we're never going to get a foot on Saudi Arabia. But we have this other country who's trying something new.
Yeah.
Let's give him a bunch of money, and that way they will pay us back in oil.
Hmm.
And the thing is that oil is an extremely capital intensive industry
Sure.
and it
Yeah.
requires security for long term. It
Yeah.
requires foreign exchange stability for long term. And so with all the changes and all the constitutional crises and changes in taxes, and it just became very messy. The oil production collapsed threefold. So it went from around 3 million barrels per day to a million barrels per day
Mm, mm,
in the span of 10 years, which is a
mm.
lot.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of investments stopped. And now, basically, what's happening is that Venezuela is the only oil that's being produced is being sent to China, or at least given to China as part of those oil for loan schemes
Yeah.
that
The loan
happened.
repayment.
Yeah,
And this isn't, so that's where it is today. So in any case, I think that if you look at this three-stage tragedy of self-inflicted wounds, we're deep in the first stage here in the US. And we've talked about that enough. I don't want to just do nothing but talk about this, although we can go all afternoon because it's a huge conversation. We Said Farewell: Stories of Forced Exile is the book that Amanda has written. And she's working on another book of her, a memoir, and we'll do that too. So we're going to invite you back for that. You can talk to Ernie when we're done here. But what I want to say about this book and getting into it is that a problem with dealing with fiction, even though it's fiction based in fact, and a lot of this has to do with your life, or at least your experiences of the kind of people you knew in the big story you've just told us, um, is that you can't just retell the story of each person in it because that's what you read the book for. So take it as a given that the stories are good, but the parts I'm zeroing in on are ones that connect with larger themes that we can sort of talk about either in terms of your story, because I'm interested in you, and we've already gotten some of that, or kind of larger things. So I'm not going to retell the five stories, but I am going to dive in here, um, and look at things that you say, um, that really have a wider implication in terms of our own history or just general truth, if you want to put it this way. For instance, very early in Reuben's story, we learn about the great moments in history as something epic and glorious. Because of that, it's easy to imagine wanting to be part of a generation that leaves a lasting legacy. But living through a, quote, historic process is not as wonderful as movies would have you think. Everything looks romantic when packaged as a polished hero's journey. However, in my experience, living through a, quote, historic process sucks. I've come to think that's why the Chinese have a curse that goes, may you live in interesting times. And we've kind of been talking about that. But of course, you put these words in the mouth of someone else. But having just been talking to you now for half an hour, this is straight from your head. I mean, this is you. So I'm not gonna, this is Amanda Quintero. Say your last name one more time.
Aguerrevere.
Okay, well, thank you for mispronouncing it. It's like I speak French, and so the first time I ordered a beef in America in a cafe somewhere in Texas 50 years ago or whatever it was, and I said au jus because I read it like the French says, beef au jus. She didn't know what I meant until she said, "You mean beef au juice. And then it was like I could make my order. So I'm sorry to make you mispronounce your own name. I mean, that's really
No worries.
insulting. If it was French, I could say it, but I don't speak Spanish. Forgive me. So, okay, let's just talk about that opening quote. And then you say Venezuela was one of the first oil exporting countries in the world. And this again comes from the story of Reuben. It went from being a coffee and cocoa plantation to a modern democracy in a matter of a few decades, attaining such high purchasing power that there's even a Bond 007 movie in which the villains demand to be paid in Swiss francs or Venezuelan bolivars. Bolivars. And that's such an interesting thing. So again, as I dip into the book and I read passages to you, I'm choosing ones that are sort of telling you a story that's your story as well as their story, a kind of a general background. And again, this sort of self-inflicted wound idea. So let me jump to another one, from Fermin Toro to La Centrale. I guess I say it like an Italian, but I guess Spanish would sound differently. It's crazy to think how trivial decisions can have so many consequences. I love that. You could put that as a chapter heading to so many things. I mean, first of all, talk a little bit about the story I just took that quote out of and tell that story a bit, but also, again, what in your own life was a trivial decision that had consequences and or a national trivial decision, like say letting Donald Trump run for the Republican nomination that he then won. It's like, oh, it was so funny. Here's this billionaire. Of course, he won't be president. I mean, it was a trivial decision by the Republican Party to allow him to run. Turned out to be pretty serious. So, talk about this trivial decision business in your own life.
So the five stories are actually real stories of real people that I
Yes, yes.
fictionalized.
I should have
And
said that. Yeah,
of course, there's a lot of my words into that fictional part. I
yeah,
would say 80% of the book is real, like 100% real.
yes,
And then that other 20% is me weaving in comments or context
yeah,
or maybe extra characters that needed to
yeah,
say something. I needed to put it in someone's mouth.
yeah,
So I think if I went back to a story like Ruben. So Ruben is very much in a stage that you could compare to what's happening now in the United States, in that you are at the very beginning of the process, and all you have is the frame of reference of the decades before, and you don't think, but it doesn't cross your mind that the state can collapse and so rapidly.
yes. So that's a huge point because we're all stunned by how fast this is going with Trump. I mean, who would have thought the collapse of the US economy at its strongest ever in history would be happening before your very eyes and so quickly?
And when you are in a situation like that, all you have is your frame of reference. So
Yeah,
Venezuela was such a stable economy with such a stable um, coin with like international partners. A lot of South American or Latin American organizations worked from Venezuela because it was the most stable partner in the region.
sure.
Um, so it was inconceivable to a character like Ruben, who was
Yeah,
living at the very beginning, maybe 3, 4 years into the Chavez government, to think that because he went and signed a petition to impeach the president, that he
yes.
was going to have to leave the country as a
Yeah.
consequence of that trivial fact.
Well,
Because
like these journalists in America who are now being threatened, and Trump is actually having their lives threatened by posting about them. And all they did was write an op-ed. And now people who wrote an op-ed, say, supporting the Palestinians, are being deported.
exactly. So it's that kind of thing that you've never seen in
Yeah,
your country. So you are acting thinking that, the worst that's going to happen is that you're going to have a conversation or you're going to have a disagreement or that well, maybe not going to have a pleasant moment, but you're not thinking that you might never get it. In the case, so the story of Ruben, which is this story, he studied
yes,
petroleum engineering, and he signs this petition as a student. And when he did, it was sort of trivial. Everyone around him was doing it.
sure.
He did not conceive that because he was signing a petition to have an impeachment referendum, that he was never going to be able to find a job in the oil industry in Venezuela. It was inconceivable.
Yeah.
And that happens in this stage of at least the Venezuelan case. And it's one of especially that first story is full of trivia.
Well, and it's happening exactly now. I mean, and there's no way to avoid this, but when you see the National Health Institute and all these other research projects are being cut to punish universities that Trump doesn't like for their politics, and now cancer research that's on the cusp of a breakthrough is not happening. You know,
Well, in
hundreds of
that
millions of dollars worth of cancer research, you know, Alzheimer's research, all the things that Trump's voters are going to suffer from because they're humans like everybody else. 10 years from now, you know, when they're not getting medical treatment, they're going to say, how could you ever have imagined that my vote cost me my life?
Well, in the story of that guy, so Ruben,
Yeah.
it's a series of things that seemed trivial at the time, but they have massive consequences
Massive
down the line. So, for
consequences in his
example,
life. Yeah.
as he is in university, he
Yeah.
witnesses a major strike in the oil industry.
Yeah.
And the president himself goes on camera on national TV and fires 20,000 executives from the oil industry.
Which actually happened.
Of course, yeah, yeah.
And
True
it's
story.
very similar to the fact that tens of thousands of federal employees are being fired from things like Social Security that we all need.
Exactly. And so at the time, you get stuck in having the conversation like this is not possible, this cannot continue, blah blah blah. But it immediately is going to it creates a
It
path to
did
dependency,
continue. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So after that, you fired the top most senior people of the oil industry. Then
Yeah.
they left. Then there were no people to teach the upcoming generation.
Yeah.
Then there were no people to work in the oil industry. Hence, 10, 12, 15 years later, the industry collapsed,
Yeah.
absolutely collapsed. And at the time,
Yeah.
it seemed relatively simple, like, well, you fired a bunch of people.
Yeah.
Well, they have consequences.
Well, and also the expertise goes with them. And the oil industry is very basic when it comes to science, expertise, engineering. You can't replace these people.
You
And with
can't.
Trump firing all the people at our agencies, whether it's the Internal Revenue Service, how are we going to collect taxes? Social Security, you can't get answers anymore. He's fired all the people that know how to run the system.
The other part that's very scary that happens in this story and that seemed a little trivial at the point, and you could compare with the Trump administration right now, for example, is something like Pete Hegseth being appointed to the Pentagon.
Yeah.
That started to happen in Venezuela. You had these nobodies that were just someone from some channel or someone from the radio or someone from, like his cousin or whatever, appointed to this very important government
Yeah.
positions, and that has consequences
Well, and not
because
only did this happen with Pete his in the Pentagon, but this is his whole pattern. There's nobody qualified in there. It's all just people who like him.
and one thing that you would think is, well, we can endure one administration. But one
Yeah.
thing that we saw happen in Venezuela is that if they persist and they become the head of these organizations, you might see a talent drain. People who work for these people and they are not happy with that situation, they will go somewhere else. And once there is an exodus of talent out of government, if it lasts long enough, it is a way to hollow the government and
Yeah.
hollow that expertise.
Yeah. And it's weird because in America we have this overlapping agenda where the conservatives and the right wing have always thought the US government is too big. But already, for instance, the Wall Street Journal, that's a Rupert Murdoch paper, and very much on the Republican and conservative, the government's too big, it wastes money, let's put it in private hands. They're now regretting it and have turned completely against Trump and saying he's hollowing our country out and our economy is going to collapse. There's a quote here where I wrote above it, you can see in the book, I wrote Trump right because I wanted to read this to you. However, Chavez never had leftist or right-wing convictions. His convictions were whatever suited him at the moment. He spoke of social justice when it suited him, but on issues like strikes and protests, his inner right-wing military man came out. In other words, I just want to read that again. Chavez never had leftist or right-wing convictions. His convictions were whatever suited him at the moment. I mean, That's the exact character of Donald Trump. And I think of a lot of strongmen, it's when you, for instance, look at Hitler, a lot of what he had was a socialist program of nationalizing state agencies in Germany. And, he wasn't right wing in that sense. He wasn't about free enterprise. It's very hard to pin down what his ideology was because it's always about him. It's what he got up in the morning thinking about, whatever happened that day.
And the bone I have to pick there is not with the strongman or president,
Right.
is with the media and the way they report it, because they
Yeah.
do immense, immense damage by reducing it to one corner and immediately alienating and ostracizing another part of the population just because you put a label on it.
Yes.
Now in Venezuela, it is a sin to mention the left. Like,
Mm.
after the experience of living through the Chavez era,
Yeah.
any Venezuelan that you see abroad is as right wing as they get for the most part, just out of trauma, out of
Mm-hmm.
listening to so many journalists say that those were socialist measures and left wing policies. They were not. If you tear them apart and you look at what was happening, they were not left wing.
Right.
However, the media, the lazy journalists,
Yeah.
labeled it like that and did enormous damage to the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And basically what they couldn't deal with was to honestly expose the kind of random personality infused policy, if you want to call it that way, of this of Chavez in the same way that we're calling Trump a conservative and Project 2025, and he's in with the Roman Catholics, but it only as it suits him on that particular issue. He has no
Of
ideology
course.
and that never has. It's just about him. And another place where I've written Trump in the margin here, from the beginning of the 20th century, whoever ruled in Miraflor had the keys to the oil industry and governed by distributing oil revenues to the different sectors of society, hence creating social peace by way of buying loyalties. And that's exactly, again, what is happening. It's not creating social peace, but Trump is buying loyalties. And so he bought Elon Musk and he's bought the people who run Meta and Amazon. These billionaires all showed up at his swearing in. And they're okay. Elon Musk will still be able to run his space program as long as the economy doesn't collapse completely. Um, but if you're outside of that group, you're completely out of luck, not just for government contracts, but you're going to be pushed to the margin. So
Yeah.
that's
There's a
part of it.
guy who used to be a trader at Citibank who's now running a YouTube channel called Gary Economics.
Yeah.
He's British. I highly recommend it for that kind of conversation because he does a great job at pointing the mass consequences, the consequences for the majority of billionaires ruling our day and age.
Hmm. Hey, speaking of which, one of the things I always ask our guests to do is after I say goodbye, which I'm not saying because I want to keep talking for quite a long time here with you, but when I do, please stay on because give my producer Ernie Gregg that name and anybody else you think we ought to be talking to because we find some of our best guests by having somebody recommend them to us. So stick around and talk to Ernie and also talk to him about things, how we can help promote you and also to book you to talk about your new book. Speaking of which, this is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We also have a book club called It Has to Be Read that sort of goes with my commentary page. It has to be said. And we would like to make your book one of our book club offerings in July.
Thank you.
So we will do that.
Fantastic.
And Ernie and you can talk about that as well. So I want to read something from Alberto and the kidnapping in Costa 905. At the beginning, you say, I usually never talk about the time when I was kidnapped, only if someone mentions that I was, at which point there's nothing else to do. I have to tell the story, but I always do it as quickly as possible and with the least amount of detail necessary. It pisses me off because people get all shocked and ask for more details, especially those who have never been exposed to real life kidnappings. For a moment, they forget that this is something you've lived through and you are transformed into a source of entertainment for them. It's a great opening paragraph or two there, but in addition to which, just set up this story of Alberto in terms of what was happening in Venezuela with some of these kidnappings and why you included this story.
So that story is very spooky. The real guy, the real person behind Alberto's a close friend of mine, and he was kidnapped when about 2015. So we had recently graduated. It in this state failure that I was mentioning earlier, one of the first things that we start seeing was the rise of kidnap for ransom. In other places, sometimes you have kidnappings for political reasons to send a message. In this case, at the beginning, it used to be just like to take you up to an ATM and empty out your bank account. Um, as the currency became less and less valuable, it became more of a negotiation in US dollars. Um, and that is the story that is told in the story of Alberto. So Alberto is the chronicle, minute by minute, of a person who was out in the street at night and gets kidnapped for ransom. And the wildest part is it's the conversations with the kidnappers.
With
They
the
are just
kidnappers, yeah, which I got in there.
otherworldly.
But I wanted to know, did you intrude that you included that story because it was happening quite a bit,
Mm,
and not just to your friend, but also it was part and parcel with the general self-inflicted wound, because before all this was going on, Venezuela wasn't somewhere you got kidnapped. It was
exactly.
it was a very stable place.
And it was a very new phenomenon. I included it because it was very representative of what was happening at that time. While living in Venezuela, I had 13 friends that were kidnapped
Hmm.
in the span of 5 years. Like
Yeah,
it was a thing that became normalized, and it meant that whoever wasn't kidnapped was very afraid. Like I
sure,
was,
absolutely.
I don't know it. Literally, there's a dialogue in that story that is totally mine.
Yeah,
Every morning when I went into my car, the first thing I would do as I got in the car was to think, if I get kidnapped today, who am I going to call and how much money do I have in my bank accounts?
yeah.
Like imagine that being the first thought that you think as you
Yeah,
step
getting
out of
into
the
your
house.
car. Well, and also, once again, for Americans that are saying, thank God that doesn't happen here, nor did anything else that the disorder Trump has brought happen. But when you unleash chaos, the person who unleashes it can't just suddenly call it back. So
Yeah.
when, for instance, the FBI, just to take one example, and our intelligence services are now turned over to people who are completely unqualified in the same way we've done in our military and all these other post-Trumps filling with completely bumbling fools, unqualified people, top to bottom, who are simply there because they have an idolatrous view of him. They kind of worship him, or they say they do. They know how to relate to him. Who knows what happens because law enforcement is being hollowed out in the United States as well. Our top
Yeah.
agencies are no longer serious agencies. They're now in the hands of idiots.
Not only that, in that specific case, there's also a narrative that is trying to portray that in the case of Venezuela,
Yeah.
in the same way that, for example, the CIA funded the Taliban, for example. Let's take
Yes.
the example of the Taliban.
Sure.
They
Before
were
the,
an ally at some point, and they
yes.
just got out of hand. That is
Yes.
exactly what happened with these people. They were initially civilian guerrillas,
Yeah.
and they got weapons from the government
Yeah.
because they were supposed to endorse the party and become this like
Well, very much like our
vigilante.
right-wing militias, the Proud
Yeah,
Boys, who he pardoned. They
exactly.
attacked our
So
our congressional building. They attacked our democracy, and he pardoned them all. These are armed militia groups.
exactly. So imagine if you had that kind of widespread militia and they become such an overt partner to the government
Yeah.
that law and order just, pretends like they haven't noticed that they're doing illegal stuff. And that is
Yes.
what happened. It got out of control.
Sure. Yeah. So now I'm going to just read something here. Um, Once everyone understood that the colectivos had the government's permission to run wild, the situation escalated. As long as they were with Chavez, colectivos knew that the government wasn't going to impose order in the prison situation, and above all, impunity before justice, because by that time, practically all judges who were not openly bending to Chavez's demands had been removed from office, or in this country, people have been appointed to begin with because they were sycophant worshippers of Trump. In other words, no colectivo member who identified as a Chavista or a MAGA voter, to put it in American context, and put on a red shirt, love that because it's a red hat here, with Chavez's face on it, were going to be prosecuted. That's an exact parallel to what happened with the people who stormed the Capitol, but also is happening now to all these violent right-wing groups that our government agencies are completely ignoring now while they prosecute supposedly anti-Semite students because they have protested against the state of Israel. The whole legal structure is now being turned on its head, where actual violent people can have their guns, have their militia groups because they wear a MAGA hat. All is
Yeah.
excused. We're very much at that point right now here in America.
Yeah, I would imagine that the justice in the United States is a lot stronger than it was in Venezuela at this point because this is not happening at the beginning. This is happening 10 years down the road.
Yeah, but
So,
we're seeing echoes of what will be happening 10
right.
years down the road, especially since this guy's talking about having a third term and saying he's got legal people trying to find a way to do this. Or J.D. Vance, who's a complete sycophant follower of his, would be the president and it would continue. If you think of what's happened in the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, play that out for 4 years and see where
Yeah.
we are with the
That's the
militias.
thing that you don't know how quickly things can evolve
Yeah.
and how one seemingly trivial consequence like letting a militia act on its own,
Or
you know,
pardon all the
set an
guys that stormed
example.
or pardon the guys that stormed the Capitol, some of which
Yeah,
who attacked police officers.
it snowballs.
Hey, we get to the story of Yakari and the irregular operations in the Amazon jungle. I've skipped a bit. Losing a child is the greatest pain that exists. Some might say that you can never know for sure since pain is so subjective and you cannot compare. But giving birth to a human being is a unique experience that tears your body apart and at the same time opens your heart in a way that cannot be described. I would dare to say that a mother's love is the purest and most unconditional love after the love of the creator. So I find it interesting. And then you say, well, you can imagine me with this indigenous looking face of mine sitting on the floor, leaning against the bookshelf, reading and crying my heart out in the mix of pain and indignation and anger, trying to find solace in a God that is undoubtedly still God of the white man, of the how do you say that? Yaranabe, who came to colonize these lands. For what? At whose expense? Let me explain without haste that the stories are told in my hometown. So you have a story here about someone who is indigenous. And of course, again, there's a parallel to our own country, but also in terms of Venezuela. Just give us a very short thumbnail on that, because like all of the other countries in South America, there was an original population there before it became a modern state.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to in the United States. There was what today would be called a genocide of most of the indigenous people.
Yeah,
They were driven out through different reasons, or they died of illnesses, whatever. But so in Venezuela is one of the most extreme cases because, for example, in Peru or Bolivia, you have a bigger indigenous population, but in Venezuela, they represent kind of like 5% of the population, and they kind of became entrapped in their own reserves
yeah,
that are quite inside the jungle. It's not like don't imagine your Indian reserve in I don't know, Montana with a casino with stuff. No, this is like the kind of people who live out in the jungle. And they had not had a legal status forever since the colony. They never had a legal status. They didn't have citizenship. And when Chavez came in, he was the first president to actually go through the process of granting citizenship rights and doing like giving IDs out so these people could vote. And they start promising these people that they're going to give them back their lands, which is something that every indigenous cause, First Nations, from Canada all the way down to Argentina have faced. So Chavez says, you vote for me, I'm gonna give you your lands back. And that story is a story of disappointment because although these people believe him and vote for him, of course, the lands are never given back. Not only that, the lands are given to the cartels to now exploit gold illegally, diamonds illegally, and produce cocaine illegally. You're muted, Frank.
I muted it so I could turn some pages without disturbing you. That was that story, and I'm glad you included it. Okay, so I'm going to go back and just reintroduce the book. We said Farewell Stories of Forced Exile that Amanda wrote. We're going to make it a July offering in our book club. You're going to stay on and talk to Ernie when I get off here to book you for your new book when it comes out and have another conversation. And we'll talk about this book again at the same time and also give him some ideas of guests that you think we ought to be talking to, the gentleman you mentioned and anybody else and so forth. So, but before we wrap it up, let me just ask you about your status in France. Did you come to France as a refugee or as a student,
No, as a
or
student.
how was that? You
Uh,
you came as a refugee?
Bureaucracy.
Yeah, but I mean, did you come as an economic, did you come as a sort of a political refugee looking for asylum, or how was that?
No, no. I went through the normal immigration process.
Okay, normal immigration.
I
But
applied to a master's,
and
registered,
you
got
did the whole
visa.
thing. So
Yeah.
how do you must have some view of the fact that in the US we have this very weird thing, and that is that we've now, we're a nation of immigrants who have now turned against immigrants altogether, not only closing the border, but deporting people and starting to deport people because Trump's people are looking for people whose views they don't like, in addition to just their legal status as immigrants. So again, I don't know if there are some parallels with Venezuela, but this targeting of people because of their political views, it's happened before in America, but it's happened from like Joe McCarthy or it's some era, but it's never been the president's thing. It's never been from the top of the government. There was always someone else to appeal to, especially the courts. And so I find it really interesting that what happened in Venezuela is the beginning of the end of the forced wound that Venezuela bore was when the courts abrogated their duty and bent to the will of Chavez. Um, maybe talk a little about that.
Yeah, well, Venezuela also, like I think every state in the American continent is a country of immigrants.
Yes,
Very obviously, Venezuela in particular, because not only it was a colony, but then it was such a prosperous country that there were many immigration waves all the
sure.
way to the 80s. I
Yes.
mean, I grew up in a place where basically every other person had a second passport. Um, in my experience, because I grew up in that environment where, we had people from every dictatorship that you could come across. I mean, they were Portuguese from Salazar, and there were Spaniards from Franco, and there were people from Chile, and there were people from all over South
Yeah.
America. So I grew up with a lot of foreigners around, and they were never a problem until the economy started going down, honestly. So
Yeah.
I always like my position is that immigrants, and later on, as an immigrant myself, I have the conviction that immigrants are only a problem when the economy is not going well and you are looking for a scapegoat to target.
Mm.
Like, oh, the real problem is this. The real problem, it's kind of like Nazi Germany, like were the Jewish people the problem? I doubt it. I think it was
Yeah.
an easy target.
Yeah.
And it was easy to kind of like, you know, put together the efforts and it create a rhetoric and, point everyone's hatred and frustration at one target.
Yeah.
That is my opinion
On the immigration thing.
on
Yeah,
the deportation part, on
yeah,
the
and the whole
deportation.
deportation part. And of course, now it's becoming ideological because the people getting deported are part of an immigrant community, but there's a whole nother group that the government is targeting and targeting universities that they're studying in revenge for views we don't like, which is a whole new thing. This is very, I mean, literally, you can say this is un-American in terms of our tradition of free speech and so forth. Um, so, yeah, you were going to say something.
No, I was gonna say that it happened in Venezuela and it's happened in every strongman political regime. The universities are always very liberal places.
Yeah,
And they always become this problem for a government that thrives in misinformation. I think that's
yeah.
that's the something new.
Yeah, it must be really strange for you to be having had this life experience in Venezuela, and now you're sitting in France and talking to me in America, having translated a book into English that'll be available here and another book you've written, because you actually bring some insight to the table, which Americans are now living through. And it's like, you can look at us and say, been there, done that, and here's how it all ended.
I wouldn't
How's it
recommend
working
it.
out? My question to everybody now on the left and the right is, okay, how's it all working out for you? And I asked the same question of my left-wing friends in America, who basically did what you said was happening in Venezuela, and that is they ignored the plight of the people who were not fashionable, who were not rich, who did not have a voice. And they didn't, that's the great sin of the universities and the knowledge class and the media and all the rest. They were able to function as if somehow these people were just unimportant. And then of course, that's the MAGA movement, and it came to bite them.
Yeah, that's just the political process right there.
Yeah.
At this point, I just that's what I think. It's just the political process. It is a constant, for lack of a better non-Marxist term, it is always a struggle of interest groups and classes.
Yeah. And of course, the other shoe to fall here is when the economy really does go into recession, which Trump will put it in unless someone stops him. And who that would be is unclear. You know, we are already turning on each other here in a divided country before anything really bad happens. In other words, in your book, you have people sort of hoarding rice and beans because times are going to get tough. And what do we do? We're not quite there yet. But if we have stratospheric inflation combined with a weakened dollar and the stock market crashing, people unable to retire, jobs going away, you know, this promise that we're going to bring manufacturing back when everybody knows it's going to be robotics anyway, and manufacturing has long since moved past the kind of old factory floor. There are so many hints that, we could be on the way to a real economic crash. Then we'll really be tested. And of course, the Venezuelan experience isn't good. We're not going to pass that with very flying colors because we're not used to real suffering in this country on a massive scale, a real loss
Not
of
since the
economic
Great
energy.
Depression.
Yeah. And the kind of people who will go through another Great Depression in America if it happens, I don't think had the stamina of the people who came out of World War I and II, or World War I anyway.
I
It's a
guess
different
time
kind
will
of,
tell.
yeah, we'll see. So final word here. What do you think? What do you see from sitting in France as somebody from Venezuela looking at what's happening here? Obviously, my frame of reference for this discussion, because I'm in the US and this is an American-based podcast, has been to bring it home to this. But of course, your book, We Said Farewell, is a work of fiction that's worth reading just for the stories. But unfortunately, you know, and there's too many applications to our present moment to only look at it from that point of view. And I highly recommend it. And in July, we'll make this our book club. Okay, stick around and talk to Ernie. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Frank, for having me.
Yes, go out and look at Paris for me and
All
enjoy
right,
it.
I will.
Go have a cup of coffee somewhere and think, this is for Frank here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, tout de bien, and we'll talk next time.
À la prochaine.
À la prochaine, and reste avec nous pour un moment.